Lots of familiar faces. We should go down and clean out the happy hour. Tell them to come up here, it's a much better hour. Well, I'm Lynn Cutler, fellow at the IOP for at least a couple of more weeks. And I want to welcome you to the panel. Hi, John. Welcome you to this panel of most remarkable and wonderful women, all of whom are currently members of the Congress, members of the House of Representatives. They also are women who were among the many incumbents who were not reelected on November 8th. And it occurred to me, as many of you told me about how upset you were after the election and how you were maybe having to rethink this whole concept about going into government and public service, and there was general kind of angst, which all of us felt, and some more acutely than others, that it would be a good thing for you to see that they are alive and well and making great plans for the future, and for them to talk about public service with you from their perspective. Congresswoman Long is from Indiana. She's a farmer by upbringing and training, and also an educator. She worked in politics for many years and ran for office a few times before it worked. She was famous for winning the special election in which she took Dan Quayle's seat after he was elected vice president. So she came to Washington quite a hero to everybody. I remember walking around a dinner with her, and everybody was just jumping up, so excited to meet her, so glad to meet her. It was such a great symbolism. She is now currently one of 3 people being actively mentioned to be the next Secretary of Agriculture in the administration. And that's just one of the things that she's looking to as an opportunity. And so, Jill, with that, may I ask you to talk to our wonderful people here at the Kennedy School.
Thank you, Lynn. I am very happy to be here this evening. It's been a few weeks since the election, and this might actually be my first public appearance since November 8th, now that I'm thinking about it. But I was a college professor. In addition to growing up on a farm, I was a college professor before going to the United States Congress. And contrary to what you might believe, what I liked and what I think most of my friends liked was going into the classroom and talking with students, listening to students. What we didn't like was writing exams and arguing over grades and those kinds of things. And it's really nice to be able to be back on a college campus and not have to do those things that neither students or faculty seem to like. There really is life after Congress, and that's probably easy for me to say because I'm still a member of Congress for a couple more weeks, but there's life after defeat, and I think that's an important thing for all of us to recognize, and also to maybe put setbacks in a broader perspective. I don't really think of what happened in my case on November 8th as a defeat, and I go back to something I learned when I was a child. Now, this will probably surprise many of you, but when I was a high school and college student, what I had set as a goal for me was not to be a college professor or to serve in the United States House of Representatives, but you'll never guess what my goals, you'll never guess this in a million years, so I won't even ask you to. I wanted to be a professional baton twirler. Growing up, and actually Karen Shepard was a baton twirler as well.
Found this out. Well, this has got to be a new course here at the Kennedy School.
we're really old. This is what you know about us from hearing this story.
Well, actually, what Karen is saying is true. It's a reflection of our ages. When I was in high school, this was before women or girls had equal opportunity in athletics. And if we wanted to compete or to be athletes, we could be cheerleaders, or we could be baton twirlers, or we could play 3 games of basketball a year and only play in half the court. I mean, that's what we had available to us in the 1960s. But one of the things that I learned in my competition in baton twirling was that you can't lose something you don't have. And I did not have a term in the United States House of Representatives beyond January 3rd of 1995. Consequently, even though I did not win my bid for re-election, I don't think that I was defeated. What I experienced was not an opportunity to go back to the United States House of Representatives. Nothing was taken away from me. I just was not given the same opportunity for an extended period of time. And I think it's very important for us to put all of this into perspective. I can remember very distinctly the first time in my life. I was a high achiever, grew up on a farm in a very rural community. Everything that I ever attempted went my way, whether it was in academics, baton twirling, whatever it was. And I can remember the very first time that I tried to get something and it didn't go my way. I found another route and ultimately got what I wanted. It had to do with graduate school, and I wanted to get into a doctoral program immediately without going through a master's program, and I was denied acceptance. So what I did was work really hard in my first semester of the master's program and then get accepted into the doctoral program after 1 semester. But I can remember that first time in my life when I didn't get what I thought I was going to, what I thought I had earned and what I thought I deserved. And I think that what we have to recognize about what happened in this country on November 8th, whether we had a special candidate that we were supporting, whether we're concerned about the change in power in the House of Representatives and the Senate, is that we have an opportunity now to move forward and to do things that we couldn't have done had everything gone the way we wanted it to on November 8th. And let me give you an example personally and then talk about what I think it means for the Democratic Party. I represent one of the most Republican districts in the United States. I have the second most Republican district in Indiana. It is incredible that I won in 1989, was reelected in 1990, and reelected in 1992. In the last 2 elections, I won with 62% of the vote and 63% of the vote. But I was never able to achieve in Congress all of the things that I wanted to because I'm very interested in policy. That's why I ran for office. But because my district is such a difficult district for a Democrat, I went home every weekend. So every Thursday night or Friday, I was flying back to Indiana, and Sunday or Monday flying back to Washington. And I spent a good part of my time on the weekends at chicken barbecues and carnivals and community events, which were very worthwhile and a very good part of my congressional experience because people became more connected with the federal government as a result of my being such an interactive member of Congress. But because of all the time I put into that aspect of my job, I was never able to do all of the things in Washington in policy that I wanted to do. And I think after 5.5 years, somebody said, somebody who knows more about all of this than I, well, it's time for Jill to do something where she can concentrate more on policy. So I think that's what that means for me personally. What I think this means for the Democratic Party, and I recognize that this is a mixed group. I am a Democrat, however, and I'm very concerned about rebuilding the Democratic Party. But what I think this means for us is that we've had a very loud wake-up call. We now, I think, can approach policy and politics differently than we would have if we had had just a slight majority in the House and the Senate. And very frankly, I think it is going to be easier for us to re-elect Bill Clinton in 1996 from this point than if we had a slight majority in the House and the Senate. Because for the first time now in 40 years, Republicans in the House of Representatives are going to have to do something other than point a finger at Democratic policy and say, this is what's wrong with it. And they are going to have to come forth with policy, and it's going to be scrutinized in the same way that Democratic proposals have been scrutinized. If you are a Republican, or if you were a Republican in the House of Representatives before November 8th, you could introduce any kind of crazy bill you wanted. You could go back to your district, you could go on national TV, and you could talk about all of the good things in your bill, and nobody would ever take a look at it, so what you said is what the public believed was there. That will no longer happen. Newt Gingrich, as Speaker of the House of Representatives, is going to be taken much more seriously, and he is being taken more seriously now by the press. So when he makes a statement, it gets scrutinized in the same way that a statement by Tom Foley or Dick Gephardt or Bill Clinton, in the same way, or George Mitchell, it now gets scrutinized. And I think in terms of public perception and public knowledge, this is something that the country needs, because I think we have to be able to clearly define the differences between the Democratic and Republican parties. And I think for us as Democrats, if we continue to push hard and do a better job of communicating what we've accomplished, which we can talk about later tonight, I think we are in a much better position going into 1995, preparing for 1996. Than if we had won a slight majority of House and Senate seats. I think we have our work cut out for us. That doesn't mean that I think everything is going to be simple or it's going to be easy. We have to work very hard, and we have to work very smart. I don't know that I have these numbers right, but in 1946, when Harry Truman was president and it was a midterm election, we lost 50-some seats in the Congress. In 1948, we gained 70-some seats. I think the voting population is probably more fickle today than in 1946. This is something that we can take advantage of. In the broader scheme of things, it is probably good for the Democratic Party, and in the long run, probably good for the country, because as Democrats, we're going to have to be more united, and we're going to have to be clear in communicating with the public what it is we are trying to accomplish for this country. With that, I think I've used my 7 or 8 minutes, and we'll turn it back to Lynn.
Thank you, Jill. Our next speaker is Marjorie Margolis-Mizvinsky, or MMM, as she wisely decided to make her campaign literature say, and lots of other things. Marjorie is an experienced and talented journalist who worked on television for almost 20 years, and in New York and Washington. She was the first single adoptive parent allowed to adopt a Vietnamese child in the early 70s, after having done an extraordinary coverage of the plight of many of the Southeast Asia war orphans. And shortly after that period, she met an old friend of mine named Ed Mizvinsky, who was a congressman from Iowa, which is my home, as a lot of you know. And they got married, and now they have so many children I can't count them. Marjorie's going to have to tell you about that. And she's written a book called A Woman's Place about this extraordinary group of freshman congresswomen that came in 1992. And has before her now, she represented a very tough district. And of course, Marjorie was known to many of you as they played the shot over and over and over as she marched down the aisle to be the deciding vote on the president's budget, on the economic plan. While she did that, the Republicans stood on the other side of the House and said, "Bye-bye, Marjorie."
How right they were.
So it was a very hard fight for a very courageous act, and I know I had talked to her earlier in the day, and she said, I will never be responsible for this happening to the president, and if the votes aren't there. And unfortunately, as the time went on and the count got closer, she was the designated hitter. But you have not by any means seen the end of Marjorie Margolis-Mizvinsky. So Marjorie?
Thanks. As Jill was talking, I was thinking, I can remember when I was really young, and I don't remember the first part, but my mother tells me that it did happen. I do remember the second part. I told my mom that there were two things that I really wanted to be. One that I wanted to do. One was to make a difference. I don't remember that part. That was somehow her transliteration of what I was saying, I think. And the second was that I wanted to run away and join the circus. And 2 years ago, I did both. I don't know why I ran. I was a reporter with NBC at the time, and I had to give up a very good job. But a small group of women, very small group of women, came to me and said, "Look at this. This is going to be an interesting year. It's going to, you know." So we have 11 kids altogether, and we put these children in these pathetic little shirts that said MMM, and we took them from mall to mall to mall. And I had them convinced that it was civics, not child abuse. And they would shake these people's hands, and they would say, "Could you please vote for my mother?" It was so pathetic. And it was 92. It was a good year for Democrats. It was a good year for women. My district is 2.38 to 1 in registration. It is the most Republican district represented by a Democrat in the country. So I knew it was on loan. I knew that it would be amazing if I won it. I won it only by 1,373 votes. But it was a good year for women. It was a good year for Democrats. And so I kind of squeaked by, and on the night of the election, I wrote a letter. I only went in with a concession speech because I had no idea I was going to win, none. And it was a letter to my littlest son, who's 12, and it said, "Dear Andrew, this is no time for tears." Was able to cross that out. But you know, think of it. In Montgomery County, close as a whim. It was going to be hard for him to understand that. Actually, as it turned out, I could keep most of the letter. But I hope that on the year that you walk in to vote for the first time, on this day in the year 2000, there will be no more talk of the woman as the outsider, and there will be no more talk of the outsider. And we'll see a different Congress. I think the saddest thing for me in this election is that we've really turned the hands back. I mean, what are we talking about? And I don't want to be, I don't mean to make this a downer, but I mean, I wrote this book. I brought a show and tell. And I mean, so there's some really interesting statistics. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. I can tell you what the campaign was like, the 1992 campaign. I mean, I will never forget a guy walking over to me at a train station, and I said, "I'm Marjorie Margolis," it's a horrible name, Marjorie Margolis-Misvinsky, I'm running for Congress. And he said, "Have you ever done anything before? Have you ever run for anything? Have you ever held public office?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, then you have my vote." And I think in capsule, that's what 92 was a lot about. I mean, it was about the year of the outsider. It was about women who had never really served in office before. People were willing to have a whole different look, and we really raised the hopes of a lot of people, and they wanted things done very quickly. They wanted change. They didn't know what kind of change they wanted, but they wanted change. And I think that what we were able, I mean, this is what I was able to do, was really, I'm really proud of some of the things that I got done. First thing I had my name attached to was $35 million in additional funds for breast and cervical cancer research. For years at the NIH, they never used female rats in experiments. I mean, think of it. They didn't use female rats. I mean, it's really extraordinary. For us to have to talk them into that, for breast cancer studies.
Male rats for breast cancer.
Honestly, they used male rats. I was told that there was no way that I could get a 5% goal for women-owned businesses for government contracts. 2 years ago, we spent $180 billion on government contracts, and women got 0.6% of 6% of 1/10 of what they should. You know what I mean. Very little. But they got just a teeny weeny bit of anything over $25,000. And I said, let's just have a 5% goal, not a mandate, not a quota. That they said couldn't be done. On September 20th, that passed. I mean, I could go on and on and on telling you about what women did in this Congress, and it was really extraordinary. I'm sitting next to somebody who everybody should be so proud of. And in this book, I talk about how women have to accept their victories, and it's going to be harder and harder. But we are 11%. We still are. But a lot of the new women are anti-choice, and I think that we've got to send women there who really represent what women care about. And I think that what our job was there to redefine what women's issues are. They're all of our issues. They're not women's issues. I mean, is sexual harassment a women's issue? It is not a women's issue. It's everybody's issue. Karen was the leader in making sure that there was congressional reform. We had to take our victories kind of in different ways. We had to make sure Eva Clayton was the first woman president of a freshman class, African American. That was a victory for all women. So we had to kind of define what we were doing there in a very different way. And when people say that we still have the same number, we're still 11% in Congress. Think of it. There are more members. There are 43 members of the Women's Caucus, which was history as of yesterday. But there are more members of the Mushroom Caucus, 60 members of the Mushroom Caucus. I mean, what do they talk about? Manure and saute? I mean, what do they talk about? So, I mean, we're talking about a whole different kind of representation. And so I thought for us to get down there and make sure that things were going in a different way, that we had a different kind of voice, was very important. There have been 11,377 members of Congress since it started. There have been 163 women. Not a lot. And what we need to do, had we continued to be represented as we were in the 90s, we would have been equally represented in 451 years. Now, if we continue to go along this way, I think it's like 320 or something like that. But we've got to make sure that the difference is represented, that there are more minorities, that there are more women, that we start to look like the rest of the nation. And I don't think that we do. And I think this election was really scary. As Hillary said, you gotta feel sorry for a guy whose mother named him Newt at birth. But I'm not so sure. I mean, that's absolutely where my sorrow stops. Let me just tell you a little bit about. Let me tell you a little bit about this campaign. Give me the hook when you want me to. My campaign was one of those wonderful. I mean, we did everything we possibly could. We had 5 phone banks all the time. We raised a ton of money, having to do a little bit with the vote. We had volunteers coming out of our ears. I'll never remember coming here for when we had our freshman orientation, and someone who was doing a study on how the women won asked me how many volunteers I had. We had like 2,200 volunteers, a huge number of volunteers, and we got this enormous number of volunteers again. And there was a kind of the campaign was fundamentally different. I mean, I can remember. I mean, this is the other anecdote. Remember the man in the train? Woman walked over to me and said to me, "I can't stand you. I think you are a scum." And then she went through the whole, "I'm a baby killer. I mean, I wouldn't vote for you for anything," but the whole business. And she just, because in your face, unbelievable. I mean, I just stood there and I looked at her and I put my hands on her shoulders and I said to her, "You know, I honestly think if we got to know each other, the feeling would be mutual." There was an awareness then that what we are looking at is a very different kind of electorate. What are we looking at? We are looking at an electorate that has finally said, "I'm going to hear what I want to hear, you're going to tell me what I want to hear, and I'm not going to hear what I need to hear." And I really want to get into that later when, if you have any questions about it, but there was a very different kind of feeling out there this time, very different. And although I thought we could pull it off and we came very, very close, I knew at some point that we were really talking to very different people. On Friday, our numbers crossed. We looked at our numbers and we went. On Saturday, I went to a church bazaar. We did a lot of church bazaars. And the minister came over to me and said, "Do you want to see what we're putting in the insert in our prayer program tomorrow?" And I said, "Sure." And he showed me something from the Christian Coalition, which frankly was scary. First of all, it was totally untrue. I said to him, can I just look? And she said, "Sure." And I said, "Why are you doing this? I mean, that's not true. That is misleading. That's a lie. I didn't vote that way." And we went down, and he said, "Well, our fellowship commission wants to put it in here." I said, "Some fellows." But this is what was out there. It was anger. It was God and guns. For those the people who were angry about the assault weapons ban, and the Brady's came in for me, and the Brady bill, they come out to vote in numbers that are really quite astonishing, and we couldn't get our votes out. So on Tuesday night, when I lost, I once again wrote a letter to Andrew. This time, the first line stayed in. "This is no time for tears." Kid was crying. But basically what I said was that I think that that leadership doesn't come from the easy votes, it comes from the tough votes. That life itself comes from the tough votes and the tough choices. That, I mean, there is a really good reason why the Chinese symbol for crisis and opportunity is the same. I didn't quite say that in the letter. I thought he'd miss a little bit of that. But I think that it's very important. I'll never forget. Let me just tell you a little bit about that vote. But I mean, on August 5th, I walked down to the floor of the House, not at all accompanied by a bunch of goons taking me down there. I mean, I went down and I knew that I walked on the floor as a no vote because I didn't think it went far enough. And we always deal with entitlements on the margins. And I mean, I'm kind of, unfortunately, the entitlement queen, but I think that we've got to be much more honest about entitlements. And as I walked in, they said that the president was on the phone. Bill and I are so close. And I walked in to talk to the president, and I told him what my problems were with the bill. But I said to him I would not he said that he thought that his administration would come to a screeching halt if we didn't pass this piece of legislation. I agreed with him. I didn't like the piece of legislation, but I said I would be your 218th vote. You have to tell him what you said on that night, because it was extraordinary. But when we had 217 votes, and I had heard other Democrats say that they were going to switch their votes if it went down, I said, okay, I will be your 218th vote, knowing full well that it could cost me the election. It was the right thing to do, and I would do it again in a minute. But it was very hard to explain to people what the 218th vote was all about. I mean, they just thought that I was crazed. But at every step of the way, and I knew as I was walking down there that I would love to run the race against me, because it was such an easy 30-second spot. But it's what it should be all about. What happens with people in Congress is that they get down there and they vote to stay. They don't get down there and vote to make a difference. And it's very important that we, as seen through you, make sure that we get out there and let people know what's important, that we can't listen to this nonsense that's in the contract. I mean, what are we talking about? We're talking about somebody who is telling us that we can balance the budget, we can spend more on the military and give you back a tax rebate. Nonsense. Without socking another $1 trillion into our debt, that's your debt. And there's no way that you're going to be able to figure out how we're going to not pass this on to our children without huge complications if you don't stand up there and say enough is enough. And it's exactly what you want to hear, but it's not what you need to hear. Anyway, I think we've got to stop whining and get on with what's going to make this work, and we can. I think that as Democrats, we can't be Republicans. I went into... I really do think that Hillary and Bill are walking around under a pigeon. I mean, it's kind of they really are working very hard to do what is right. And I think for the most part, and we had a meeting with the losers in the White House, and it was really an extraordinary experience. And basically, what I said to the president, I said, I think the only way that you can win in 2 years is if you don't care whether you win or not. And you go out there and you do what is just absolutely right. And now, I say that after having suffered a defeat. But I think it has to do with the fact that we lost the propaganda war, that the perception is that we as Democrats want to spend more, we want more government, we want to take more money from your pockets. And the Republicans want to have smaller government and want to give you back a tax refund. I think we finally have to say that we can't lead this parade from the last float. I think that we have to say, okay, we have kept this grenade in our hands for long enough, we have pulled the pin often enough, and we've never thrown it. It constantly is blowing up in our hands. And I think we have to take some victory laps. If we pass something and we do something, we have to take time to tell folks that we did it. We lost the propaganda war. Anyway, at this point, we'll stop because I'm beginning to get bored with myself. But I certainly feel free to ask any questions.
Thank you,
this is amazing. Karen Shepard is unbelievable. So is she. But I came in with her as a...
From the West, we have Karen Shepard, who grew up in the West, grew up in Utah, had a distinguished career as a journalist also, and then the field of public relations. She established a publishing company and then undertook lots of different publishing projects, sold the business, while it was successful, and moved on and decided that she would return something back to her community by getting involved in public service on an elective basis. She had done many things, served on many commissions and boards in the community, but she ran for the state senate in 1990 and was elected and served there and worked a lot on health issues. I know because I remember talking to her when she was running in 92, and she was so excited about the interest in health reform in the country and felt that she could come to make a difference. I must say, those of us who were watching at the national level, even though we knew a few Democrats had been elected in Utah from time to time, and knew that there was a woman Democratic mayor of Salt Lake City, still were not quite sure that this could really happen. It was, again, a difficult district, but Karen won and came and very quickly became one of those people that everybody knew they could go to with a thought for, not to, but for a thoughtful analysis of what was going on. She's just a star in the minds of many of us. And for those of you in the audience, let me throw in a caveat here. Let me just tell the Congresswomen for a minute one quick anecdote. That since the freshman class decided they were not coming to the JFK School for orientation after 20-some gobbledy years, and that they were in fact going to the Heritage Foundation, there's been a lot of self-examination around this place and some nervousness about partisanship and so on. And I was approached when I had this idea for the forum about, bringing in a defeated Republican woman. I said there weren't any. But, but the fact is that this goes way beyond partisanship. These three women are extraordinarily fine public servants. So if we talk in terms of the party, that is because those are the experiences we have lived and have just been through. And I know that in discussion, you will feel free to challenge that. But having said all of that, which is too much, let me introduce Karen, who is also just a leading force on some issues of concern to women, on environmental issues, and worked hard on the health care reform.
Thanks. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's deja vu of the most painful kind, because the last time I was here, I was sitting up in your seat listening, I think, probably in this room, to a welfare reform panel as a new member of Congress, and it was a very intense experience. I want to talk to you about losing and about change and about the future in terms of who the electorate has become and are right now. And I'm going to start with a person who, when this story occurred, was about many of your ages. My daughter Heather, when she was 21, 3 weeks away from graduating from Mills College in California, called me at 1 in the morning, and she said, Mother, and I was soundly asleep. And I said, Heather, can't you just call me tomorrow when I'm awake? And she said she might be in jail tomorrow. And I perked right up, I poked Vince and said, Heather might be in jail tomorrow. And I proceeded to hear that Heather had closed down Mills College along with her friends there, and they had locked everybody out of the administration building, and they were going to plan they had, you can't believe the plans they had. It sounded very perilous to me. I wanted to ask for about $100,000 back, is what I wanted to ask for at the time, but I didn't talk about it, and tried to be supportive. And anyway, that went on for the 3 weeks that you all read the newspaper about it. And at the time, I worked at the Graduate School of Business at the University of Utah, and she called me one afternoon, and she said to me, Mother, we won. And she couldn't believe it. And then she said, you know, Mother, you can actually win these things. And then all of a sudden, I realized that I had been the mother for this child who had lost all the way along the line. And why had I lost? Well, before she knew me very well, when she was a baby, I was a college teacher as well, like Jill, but I got very involved in community kinds of things and in poverty programs and environmental issues, particularly in women's programs. I started a magazine for women who work outside the home in Salt Lake City, Utah in 1978. Think about it for a minute. And we went through being boycotted over the ERA for 10 years, and we went through every possible kind of defeat where I managed campaigns that lost. I think I was the first person that won that I ever voted for. And Heather had watched this, and when Lynn called me, and Lynn is a wonderful friend who was, when I knew nobody, and nobody would take a woman from Utah who wanted to run for office seriously. She was a very important person in Washington who took me seriously. I can't tell you what it meant to me. And she watched us lose and got this message that all you do is lose. And I realized that the thing I'd like to say to all of you, and I'm so glad I'm not your age, really. I can't tell you. I'm so glad I'm not your age, but there are a lot of things you've got to do. There's a lot to be done, and you must know that losing is just part of the game, and the game never, never ends. You know what we're doing in this country is we're talking about change. Now, talk is cheap, and people talk cheaply about change. They talk about it like it can happen overnight. You know the change I wanted to make? I wanted to make the change that the wages of women would be equal to the wages of men. Now think about that one. You think I thought I could do that in 2 years? Do you think I never had more than the hope that I could make some small piecemeal contribution in my lifetime if I worked my whole lifetime. And I never expect to see that happen before I die. But that doesn't mean that what I do isn't extraordinarily important. But I felt so sad that Heather didn't think she could win these things. It was like a bolt of lightning to occur to her that yes, you can win, but also you're going to lose far more than you win. I think Ken Burns said it best in this baseball series when he said, you know, baseball's not about winning, baseball's about losing. Baseball's about losing. Everybody loses all the time. That's what it's really about. Politics is not about winning. Politics is about losing. Change is not about winning and actually getting there. Change is about being in the middle almost forever. And the more serious the change, the longer it will take. And if you have an expectation, as I think our voters did in this last election, that a certain group of bright people can go to Congress and turn it upside down and walk out, and it'll be a changed institution, we'll be a changed country, and we won't have a $4 trillion debt by magic, and people won't be sleeping homeless on the streets by magic because they all got up and got responsibility and got a good job. If you believe that, then you need to really start examining how you think about things. And what we have done is created an overly expectant electorate that is absolutely not willing to be satisfied with small change. And we live in a world where the problems are so utterly complicated that small change is all anybody can produce. Even if the Republicans are able to pull off all the institutional changes that they're talking about, which is really the same list I just worked on for 2 years. And I'll have to go in my bedroom and lie down and cry if they do it. But even if they do it, and by the way, parenthetically, I'll also be happy that they did it because they're important changes. But even if they do it, it's not going to change the person in West Valley City, Utah, who has to work in a family with 2 adults and 4 jobs between them to pay a non-living wage for their 5 children. And that person is going to be just as unhappy in 2 years as that person was now. And so these problems are with us, and this national discussion that we are having has to finally sometime get honest and straightforward, and we have to be willing to speak the unspeakable. We have to be willing to talk about things that people hate. And most of all, and Marjorie's the epitome of it, we have got to be willing to go take elected positions, not to get reelected, but to do the right thing. And we don't have enough people that do that. And I feel like Jill does and like Marjorie does. There is not one thing that I would vote differently on, even though I know all those votes added up to my accumulated loss. So that's my discourse on change, and then I'm just going to give you a few sort of scattergun observations that might provoke a conversation. I found out that it's a lot more important that I voted my conscience and my brain and my best judgment since I lost than it would have been had I won. That was a really big surprise to me, because all the time I was voting those votes, people were saying, you're going to lose, you're going to lose. And I thought, I'm going to lose, I'm going to lose. But I kept doing it, thinking I could get away with it. Turned out I'm much happier that I did it. Politics is not personal, but it is mean as hell. And it costs more, and it rewards less than it ever has. And it is not leading us to good government at this moment. And something must be done about that. Another observation. There is no other experience in my life except raising children, which is the hardest experience of all in life, in which I grew more, learned more about myself, tested myself more fiercely, more severely, or spent more time being afraid, trying to do brave things, looking back on it, assessing whether or not it was, and then taking an even bigger step the next time. It's an amazing experience. I commend it to all of you. Do it. Do it. You'll be so much better for having done it, even if you lose. And finally, my last observation is that I think we may very possibly, I'm not sure about this, but I think we may possibly live in a dangerous time. This is 6 years before the 21st century. We are going to live in a century as different in the 21st century from the 20th century as we lived in different in the 20th from the 19th. And we are filled with fear. And we are not telling each other the truth in this national discussion. And the pandering to fear is starting to sound like McCarthyism used to sound. And we have not got accurate perceptions of what we can do to solve our problems. And worst of all, momentarily at least, we seem to have lost our sense of community. You know, the thing I was raised with that said, the greatest good for the greatest number of people, that's the best. That's what you try to achieve. And I think all those things, given that we're the greatest country in the world going into the toughest economy in the world that we've ever seen on this globe, with a technology that is way beyond our moral capacity to understand it or absorb it, with communications, well, it's technology and it's everything, with the ability to communicate well beyond our capacity to absorb it or understand it. With the fact that we don't get wisdom from people anymore, we get information from them, and it's basically confusing to us. That all those things make this a potentially dangerous time. And it means that people like you at the Kennedy Center are going to be the most important people in the world, because you can be the voices of reason that we need so desperately out there. Anyway, we'll talk about anything, obviously, and we all talk too long. So thank you.
Thank all of you. All right? Who's first? And would you tell us your name and where you're from? Yes, back there.
My name's Andy Solomon. I'm a second-year master's student at the Kennedy School. Congresswoman Margulies Nesvinsky touched briefly on the role of the Christian Coalition in her re-election battle. And I'm wondering if you could each talk about the role of the religious right in your race, specifically tactics they may have used against you and how you respond.
Karen has the best stuff.
Actually, I don't. I think Utah's an unusual environment because of the role of the Mormon Church, which is both and I'm not LDS, so this is both a political problem for me and a challenge, which I really embraced, because I have been raised in Utah, and I'm of the culture very much, and I understand it very well. And the Mormons are fiercely independent, and they are fiercely not part of the Christian Coalition. And so, although it's always wrong to characterize and stereotype anyone, there certainly is a part of the LDS following that tends to be more conservative, although I would say it's probably not a bigger part than of the Catholic community. It's just about the same. And that they did really helped me, Marjorie, in keeping the Christian Coalition out. I didn't have Christian Coalition in my face until the last 4 days of the election. And what I had in the last 4 days was the voter guide, which was deceitful and lying and dishonest. And I had, for the very first time, it has never happened in Utah before, although I know that'll surprise you because it's happened so many other places. We've never had pictures of full-color fetuses, printed and passed out widely in Utah before. That happened in the Christian Coalition, or the National Right to Life organization did that, and they put it under the windshield wipers of all the people who were in church in my district on the Sunday before election, and they took out very big ads in the newspaper. But for me, it was short, intense, and I think effective.
Well, I think short, intense, and effective is exactly what was done most effectively.
Mm-hmm.
There were, I think the figure is, I think there were 8 Jewish members who lost. It's about a third of the delegation, and all were targeted by the Christian Coalition. There was a real meanness and vitriol that one just can hardly explain. I mean, the only thing that I can say about it is that it was so non-Christian. It was extraordinary, and I can't begin to tell you what it is like to be on the receiving end of something like that. And when you know that in a campaign you must define your campaign. You can't be on the defensive all the time. So to a certain extent, you have to look beyond that. And that's what I tried to do. But it was very, very hard to look beyond.
And when they hit us on the last day, obviously in the last
It was all
days,
done on Sunday.
you cannot do a darn thing about it.
It was all done on the last Sunday.
I'm a United Methodist. I consider myself a born-again Christian. I live a conservative life, but there is nothing that I have ever seen the Christian Coalition do that is consistent with the United Methodist teachings or the Christian teachings. They have been, however, extremely effective, not just in 1994, but in our state it goes back at least to 1980 when Dan Quayle defeated Birch Bayh for the United States Senate. And much of what happened this year appears to have happened back in 1980 as well, where it was toward the end of the campaign where they used tactics that we were not able to respond to. They are deceitful. They're absolutely dishonest. They distributed literature, in my case, not so much through the churches. I actually have a pretty strong Christian following in the churches and worship with a number of denominations in my district. I feel that it's a very important part of who I am as a Christian woman who serves in a public role. But they used the mail. They sent the literature through the mail, and it arrived on the Monday before the election, and it was absolutely false. But at that point, you can't really combat it. I think that we need to seriously take a look at legal recourse, because I'm not a lawyer, but I believe it's slanderous. I believe it qualifies as, potentially could qualify as slanderous literature. But I think that we need to do that because the public is being deceived by an organization in two ways: by what it calls itself, and then the information that it provides to the public. But it is
Tax-exempt status.
it has tax-exempt status. That's right. That's right. Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Deborah Schulman, and I'm a resident of the 13th District of Pennsylvania. So being from Congresswoman Mark Williams-Mesvinsky's district, I can really identify with a lot of the issues.
And you're not a Democrat.
I am a Democrat.
You're the other Democrat.
I'm the other one. Hi! Yeah, it's a pleasure. Yes. What I wanted to address is something that Congresswoman Shepherd talked about when she talked about this era being a very dangerous time. And I think one of the reasons it seems like it is such a dangerous time is precisely for the reason that you pointed out, because it seems like we're getting information from people these days, but not really wisdom. And it seems to me it's because that's what we're asking for. We're no longer really asking our legislators for their wisdom, but simply to go to Washington and do whatever it is that we've asked them to
That's
do.
what we were talking about.
And so
we
what
had
I'd like
this
you to...
whole conversation on the plane today. It was just, it's...
Great, but what I'd like to hear is if you just maybe
We
go
thought it
into
was
a little
great,
bit of
too.
that conversation, because I'm very confused personally as a young person who wants to go into this field as to what we can do about that.
We have successfully told the electorate what they want to hear, not what they need to hear. What they need to hear is that if we don't face up to entitlements and face up to them with seriousness and honesty, you guys are not going to have anything. I mean, most people of your age, for good reason, think that there is more likelihood that a UFO will land in your backyard than you will get Social Security. And so you hear everybody down in Congress saying, what? We don't have to deal with Social Security. Caca. I mean, of course we have to deal with Social Security. It's absolute nonsense. In 1950, there were 60.5 people putting into Social Security for every one who's taking out. Now there's 3 putting out for every one person who's taking out. There are more people who the fastest growing age group, thank goodness, is 85 and above. There'll be 200,000 people who are more than 100 years old at the turn of this century. There are people now who are on Social Security for longer than they put in. If you retired in 1980, you have gotten so far 5 times out what you put in plus compounded interest. And I can go on and on and on and on and on. And if somebody doesn't say nonsense, and where are we going now? We're going to welfare. Welfare is less than 4% of the entitlement pie. It needs to be revamped, for sure. But we are telling people what they want to hear, not what they need to hear. And if we don't, and if we're not honest, and if more people don't start to talk about what we need to, people don't want to talk about Social Security. Why don't they want to talk about Social Security? Because 1 in every 4 voters is a senior. And when you talk about, I introduced 5 pieces of legislation which would make Social Security solvent. One was a flat rate COLA, cost of living adjustment, introduced for the first time in 1972. just a flat rate COLA takes nothing away from your actual benefits. The average person, it would cost the average person $2.83 to make Social Security solvent at 2/3 of solvency over a 75-year period of time. I got headline after headline that said MMM wants to cut Social Security. Can't talk about it. I mean, so what we need to do is we need to be honest, and we need to be prepared not to go back, and people just aren't prepared. I knew that when I got into that discussion, it would wipe out a lot of my base, because people don't want to talk about social, but we need to talk about it, and we need to get you there, frankly, so that we avoid a generational war, which we are sure to have.
There's something else that complicates all of this, and that's that in our congressional offices, we spend a tremendous amount of time dealing with questions that come through the mail and through the phone, where people have bad information, not just about Social Security, but about all kinds of issues. And I think that the consequence is, as a government, as a Congress, as a people, we're starting to fiddle while Rome burns. We reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Education Act this year, and my office spent probably, I think this is fair to say, probably about 10 staff people working virtually full-time for about 4 weeks answering calls and letters that came in saying that they didn't want the federal government regulating homeschooling. There was nothing in the bill that would have the federal government regulating homeschooling. There was nothing in the bill to do that. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act is a reauthorization of programs that we have had in this country for years. They're relatively non-controversial, but the far right, the extremists, started with their networks scaring people who are ill-informed, have good intentions, good citizens paying their taxes, but frankly not very sophisticated, and they're getting all kinds of false information, and so they're calling congressional offices and saying, do this, don't do that. When we read the legislation to them, they say things like, you have to read between the lines. You can't read between the lines of a bill in the United States Congress. The language of the bill is what counts when it's interpreted in court.
You would have sworn that there were no people in public or private schools. If you were in any of our offices, you would have sworn, because we shut down on this issue. HR 6, everyone, it wasn't true? I mean, everyone, you couldn't, there were lines lighted, you'd walk into the office and you'd say homeschooling. It's what representative democracy should not be.
2,000 phone calls in my office over a period of about 3 days over an issue that didn't even exist, and we had to respond to all of those while we are spending your tax dollars responding to questions about non-issues. Then we are not able to address the real problems that this country faces, which is a $4.5 trillion debt, a deficit that's going to start going up in another 2 years, health care costs that keep going up, and fewer and fewer people every month having health insurance coverage. Those are the things that aren't getting addressed because we're dealing with all of these non-issues and the far right, frankly, is doing a good job of distracting the Congress, and they're going to keep doing it, and they're going to try to give a tax break to the wealthy. They're going to use dynamic forecasting so that they can make the deficit look like it's going to be smaller, and we're going to get right in the same trap that we were in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan, with the deficit going up to a degree that we can't afford, and congressional offices are going to be focusing on these non-issues because you have to respond to your constituents. And the only solution to this is for people like you, who are complex and intelligent and informed, to be active participants, very active participants in our political process. This country needs your input more at this point in history than probably any time in the history of this country.
If I had a gun to my head and you asked me, don't shoot. If you ask me why did this happen, this huge democratic loss across the country, I would say it happened because of health care. And I would put that as the number one reason, because what happened was that a serious attempt to solve what may be one of the most difficult and expensive problems in this country, both expensive to us personally and expensive to us as a country and our competitive markets internationally. That serious attempt was turned into a gargantuan government intervention into personal life. And it was believed, and I wish I had $1 for every single constituent who came up to me over the course of the last year and said, "You just keep the government out of my Medicare."
Yeah, my name is...
Maybe we should keep them out of the business of giving tax breaks for homes as well, and maybe we should, you see, nobody even knows what the government does for them, is my point. That makes this discussion very difficult. Sure. Yes.
My name is John Connors, and I'm a guest at the IOP, and my question sort of revolves around a lot that's been said over the past few minutes, and it's about the meanness in politics that is apparent today and how you win the propaganda war, because we're all preaching, hopefully, to the converted to some extent here, but I'm in business, and I hear throughout my time in business and associates, males that are, supposedly intelligent and up to date on things, that there's a lot of meanness out there. And in particular, I think a lot of people, educated people, are hearing talk shows and, the Rush Limbaughs and so forth. And I happened to be in a grocery store the other day, the morning after the Jesse Helms' famous statement. And I happened to be talking to the fellow that owns the grocery store, and in came a bread man. And delivering bread, probably making $15,000 a year. And this guy starts going off on Hillary Clinton, what we should do to Hillary Clinton. And I guess, after hearing all this stuff, the thing that I'm asking is, someone asked tonight, how do you win the propaganda war? How do you win the election? I mean, how do you get elected against this type of thinking that I think there's a sea change in the electorate now, a fundamental change in the people that are out there voting? And aside from good people going in government, how do you win the elections against this?
I think the Democratic Party, and that includes all of us on this panel, I think we have to do a better job of communicating what is really included in the Constitution, what our constitutional rights are, what the long-term impact of a certain policy change would be. And we have to do it in a way that the public is going to understand. We often spend time, and I think the liberal positions, and I am a fiscal conservative but relatively progressive on social issues, the liberal position, I think, takes more time to explain because the reasoning is more complicated than a 10-second soundbite. But I'm often reminded of a story that my dad tells. This is absolutely true. And my dad happens to be very effective. He's also socially liberal. This little farmer in northeastern Indiana who takes on all these causes almost got in a fight the other day because of a bumper sticker that he found very offensive. But he's 70 years old, but he walked into the local garage, which is like a service station, but in our community, that's where some of the retired men go every morning and literally stand around the stove in the wintertime and talk. And after the president had made his statement on gays serving in the military, my dad walked into this group who were really upset that the president was suggesting that gays ought to have the opportunity to serve in the armed forces. And when he walked in, they do respect him, and they said, "What do you think about gays in the military, Roger?" And my dad said, "Well, you're darn right they ought to serve. Why should they not have to serve when the rest of us do?" And suddenly all of these people were converted and said, yes, absolutely, gays ought to be able to serve in the military. So that's what we need to do more of. We need to communicate in a way, when we know that we're right on the issues, we need to find the hot buttons, and we need to press those hot buttons as well. But we need to do it factually and honestly, unlike the Christian right is doing. And they're not the Christian right. They're actually just the far right and call themselves Christians. But we need to fight these battles the same way. We don't need to be giving the kinds of explanations I'm giving right now that take 3 to 5 minutes. We need to answer these questions in 15-second sound bites, explaining very concisely why policy ought to be a certain way.
I think we've just simply got to seize the airwaves and the same way they did, and make it entertaining and meaningful. It's just.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And I just like to add that I think the Republicans are going to find that they have created a Frankenstein. So everything Jill is saying is right, and Marjorie's right. We have to have our airtime as well.
Frankly, it'll be much easier.
But I do think that what will really change it is when members of Congress and people who believe in public service and are seeking elected office of both parties decide that it is in all our benefit to respect these institutions, not to tear them down and destroy them. And if we believe in them, then we will do that, and we've got to reform them, number one, so that they are doing what we want them to do, the way we want them to do it. That's the first step. That's been a hard step to accomplish. And then number two, we need to have respect for them. I think all of us here, we're women in Congress, and we experience something men don't experience, I discovered, when I went around and asked everybody if they also got obscene faxes, phone calls, and really bizarre people walking in the office. And, we have seen, it's been like being a
men
cop.
don't get those things? I didn't know that.
Yeah. No,
Just
man,
guys?
it's us.
I
It's
didn't
us.
know that.
Yeah, it's us. So there's just a kind of lack of respect that really is beyond the pale, and that goes to your Hillary. That's why I was saying that about your question about Hillary, is that since we're women, they take a lot more permission with us, and it's what I include in when I said there's much less reward for running for office right now. It's very hard.
We have policemen in our driveway as we speak right now. ATF, FBI, that kind of. It's just been pathetic. It really has been. It's something that you can't hear me.
Why are
You don't want
they
to hear me. Threats, death
Oh,
threats.
because of death. Yeah.
Right this very second.
I had periods where that was true.
Well, first, my name is Chris Edelson. I'm a student at the law school, and first, Congresswoman Margulies Mezvinsky, I saw you on C-SPAN the day of the budget vote, and I just want to say that was a very inspiring thing to see you do that. And I'm really proud of you doing that, and definitely made my day, made my year, so it was great to see it. And I think that really goes to what a lot of what you've been saying about you all seem to have a sense of responsibility as public servants, which is what public service is about as far as I'm concerned. And that seems to be something in terms of the misinformation problem with Republicans like Jesse Helms and Newt Gingrich just having this incredible irresponsibility, telling people what they want to hear, easy answers. And I'm wondering if there's any possibility that you see for that changing. Is there an incentive for responsibility from these people, or can they just keep getting away with this? What do you think about that?
I think we've got to seize this moment. I think the pendulum will come back, and we were talking about this earlier, that it's for all of us to make sure that there is resonance that's on the other side. I think women have to speak up. We really lost big time this year. I think reasonable people, minorities, are going to have to come out and vote much more than they did this time. The good news, honestly, for us is that now we're in the minority. The number of times that I sat on the floor saying, boy, I'd love to just stand there and lob bombs. And that was. I think that we have a clear-cut mandate now. We've got to get out there and say, this is wrong. And it's much easier if you're, frankly, in the minority.
But we have to do it with responsibility, and I think the reason that it will swing back is that a dysfunctional electorate with short fuse expectations isn't going to work for the Republicans either. Reality always wins, always. And this is not going to work. This is the equivalent to having an illiterate electorate. And it's our sort of information age equivalent, but it's going to be in all our best interest to have much, much, much more wisdom shed on these complex problems than we've had.
At the same time, not being angry with the electorate.
Right. Well,
it's very, very hard.
That's hard.
You can't.
It's hard right now. It'll be a little easier in a couple of months. I know that feeling. I've been there. One thing I would say that I think is critical as we look down the line is that, sure, it's going to be fun. Ted Kennedy said to me, this is going to be fun. Yeah. Well, at some level, That's right, for the people that are there. But one lesson I learned as an officer of our party over 12 years is that we have also got to be for something. It is not enough that we will be against what they want. And we have an agenda. We have an important agenda. And what we have not done is articulate it and communicate the positive things that happened the first 2 years of this administration. It goes to the earlier question on the public relations war. So that's why it's important who will be the new party chair, and it was important that the president use the bully pulpit. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons, my name is Dan Maffei.
Could I interject something just before your question?
Course.
With regard to the communication war and communicating to the public, I think this is so important. You know, we have a president who has reduced the deficit more than anybody anticipated he could do. It's smaller than he projected it was going to be. The federal government is getting smaller and more efficient. Those are things that the American public across the board want to have happen, but the American public doesn't know that this president took the leadership in doing that. We have family and medical leave. That is clearly something that the American public has wanted. We've had procurement reform. This president has begun the reforms that are supported by people across the political spectrum, but we have failed at communicating that to the American public. And I think we need to spend, all of us, every day till, what will it be, November 2nd of 1996, talking about the economic growth, the reduction in the size of the government. It's going to be smaller than it's been since John Kennedy was president as a result of this president's leadership, the deficit reduction. We need to be talking about those things because we have taken the leadership. We are responsible for these things happening, and it's what the public wants.
The Contract for America calls for a $500 tax cut per child for everyone. We have already passed, and 2 years ago passed, in the deficit reduction package, a huge tax cut for every family that makes less than $30,000 a year. For some families, it would amount to a refundable tax credit of $3,400.
People don't believe it.
Nobody believes it.
No residents.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, that fits with my point pretty well. This Congress and this president have done a lot that people don't give them credit for, and there is certainly a sense of cynicism about both institutions and about the Congress that I think contributed to the last election. And my question, I'm going to address it specifically to Representative Shepard, because you worked so much on congressional reform, a lot of which did not come to pass for various reasons. But do you think any of that cynicism about the institution is justified? And if so, what do we do about it?
Well, I think that in our particular age, it's not a question of so much as whether it is factually justified as it is justified because the perception is that. The perception is that Congress lives in a bubble and it doesn't obey the laws it passes for the rest of the land, and it should, so we need to fix that. The perception is that a lobbyist has a whole lot more access to every one of us than you do, and that would have a lot more standing, a lot more say than you would have. We need to fix that perception by leveling the playing field. The perception is, and this one isn't a perception, it's absolutely true to the race almost, that you almost have to be a millionaire to run for office. Now, we didn't want a world like that. We didn't want a government that was an aristocracy. That's not what the Founding Fathers devised. We've got to fix that. And I just believe so passionately if we could fix those three things that we would be worlds and leagues ahead in terms of fixing that perception. Do members of Congress vote a certain way because a lobbyist gives them free Redskins tickets for, 10 years or something? I doubt it. But if they did, it would be one. I'm telling you, it happens. Yes, we had Dan Rostenkowski, but we also had Jill Long, Marjorie Margolis-Mizzinski, David Skaggs, William Natcher. I mean, people that worked so hard, so long, for so many years, gave their lives to this that you can't believe it. And they're the norm, but they're not the ones we hear about. So we're about really fixing perceptions instead of mostly substance, I think, in that case.
Okay, over here.
My name is John Steinberg. I'm from Cheltenham, Pennsylvania, which I guess makes me the third Democrat from the 13th. My question is...
I know, they're coming out of the woodwork.
Did you vote absentee?
Yeah, I would.
Yeah, I did. I voted for it if it makes you feel any better.
It does.
I have actually a two-part question. First, do you think that this kind of shock therapy of this last election will kind of shock the administration into emphasizing what they're doing right and doing that kind of, and mobilizing the Democratic vote in the next election? And the second part is, do you think that we should be worried at all about what's going to happen before then?
I'm afraid it's going to make people more inhibited. I mean, I hope it doesn't, but I'm afraid that it's going to make people down there even more careful as opposed to stronger leaders.
I actually have confidence that we will turn things around. President Clinton has a history of, when the chips are down, really putting his shoulder to the wheel and being extremely effective. He did that in Arkansas repeatedly. He demonstrated it in the campaign for the presidency in 1992. I think we have to take responsibility, those of us in the Democratic caucus in Congress, we have to take responsibility for the mistakes that we made as a caucus and as individuals. I don't think we should minimize the public's perception and assessment of the performance of this president, but the reality is this is one of I think, the strongest leaders that this country has seen in a long time. He has made some very significant changes for the country for the better that are preparing us for the next century, and I believe that if you look at what President Bush's popularity was in 1991 versus 1992, if you look at what happened in 1946 and 1948 in this country, I think the public does not know President Bill Clinton, and I think that it is possible to communicate to the public through the Democratic National Committee as well as through the White House that people have truly misjudged and mischaracterized who he is. And I think it's very possible that in 2 years people will say, gosh, I was wrong about my assessment of who he is and what he's accomplished. I think it can be done. I am hopeful that it will be done.
Nothing would surprise me.
Hi, my name is Eric Hochstaus, and I'm co-chair of the Kennedy School Democratic Caucus.
Oh, good.
And wanted to thank you all for coming here tonight. My question pertains to the role of the media in politics, and I'm particularly curious with the discussion here this evening about giving people what they want instead of what they need, and the role of headlines. What your perspectives would be on that, and I'm especially curious to hear from Congresswoman Margolis-Mazvinsky and Congresswoman Shepherd, since you've had dual careers on both sides of that line.
One of the things that popped into my head was I can remember talking to a group of kids from Episcopal Academy in my district, and afterwards a very obnoxious kind of pear-shaped person came over to me and started to really hit me with the most incendiary language. And at the end, he said, "I am the president of the Republican Club at school," and I said, "Thank you for sharing." And then this adorable little girl with big red ponytail said, "I'm the president of the Democratic Club here, Young Democrats, and I'm its only member." So I hope that's not true of you. I think the media has a huge responsibility, but it is very difficult. I think if you changed everyone and put a different gaggle in 3 or 4 months, we'd have the same complaints about the media. The problem really is that I don't know how to say this. There is no psychic foreplay in the media. I mean, I was a minute 40 when I worked for NBC. And when I went to Congress, I became 6 seconds. Everything has to be so condensed. If it's a headline, it's the first 2 graphs that really count. I can tell you the number of times that I was engaged in issues that I think were so important, and that which the press seized upon was one little issue that had pizzazz, that had sizzle, in this huge, and it's not their fault. It's just a fact. I mean, the you go to your desk and they say, oh, this is a much better story than that. The complex issues just don't sell. I mean, NPR is not listened to the way we would like it to be listened to. So, I mean, I don't think that there's an answer. It's the best system. I mean, we still need a free press. But the more the tabloid journalism takes over, the worse off we all are. So I wish I could say, we want to put our hands we want to put ourselves in the hands of an informed electorate. But people are pretty lazy.
That's why we need you.
I think that people can no longer tell the difference, and I'm not sure the press can, between what is press and what isn't. I've had constituents tell me that the press is Rush Limbaugh, and our local talk show host, Mills Crenshaw is his name, and they're certainly not the press, and they certainly don't attempt to be factual, and as a matter of fact, often they attempt to be non-factual, and they attempt to tell things that are just absolutely diametrically opposed to the truth. So, but the ordinary Joe and Jane doesn't know the difference between that and George Will or E.J. Dionne, who are very thoughtful, wise people from very different ideologies, but what they do every day is sit down and try to make sense of all the information that comes at people. And as long as we have it's very much a part of what we've all been talking about in terms of the dysfunctional electorate. As long as we have people who are fundamentally asking to have their expectations filled in a minute, and they want to get their information in a half a minute. What was the soundbite? 20 seconds?
Oh no, 6.
6 seconds. I mean, think about. I got to be on McNeil-Lehrer a lot of times, and it was so wonderful because you actually got to say complete sentences, if you can imagine being grateful for something so pitiful. And that is the best of the press. So I just don't think you can convey anything except lies and entertainment in 6 seconds. Maybe you can.
Oh, you absolutely can.
I mean, it's just a problem.
It's a challenge.
Question over here, and then John will probably have to cut it off unless you guys are willing to stay. You have a cab. You have
unless
a plane
somebody
to
can
catch,
fly
so.
us to Washington.
Yeah, go ahead.
My name's Alex Wally. I was born and raised in Fort Wayne, Indiana.
Oh.
And
cool.
Nobody's from Utah here.
I'm proud to say that I'm a liberal. And I voted for Jill Long.
Which high school did you go to?
Well, I actually came out to high school here.
Okay.
I went to Memorial Park.
Oh, okay.
I was in the magnet program in public school. And
a fine product of the district.
Yeah. Well, I voted for you in 1990 and 1992. And this year, I switched I voted in Massachusetts because I thought Ted Kennedy might lose. And I was very surprised to hear that you lost. My parents didn't inform me very well. They're both Republicans. However, they voted for you, I think in 92 and this year.
Would you tell them thanks for me?
I will. And so you're talking about the sound bites. You've been in office for a while, or for 6 years, 5.5 years. So you did have the chance to talk to some Republicans, and you must have necessarily convinced them and been able to persuade them that that the type of change or the type of government that you were trying to promote was a good one, one that would help people rather than hurt people. And so I guess I'd like to hear some things about how you were able to persuade people who are willing to listen to you. And the other Congresswoman may have something to say as well.
I was probably the most accessible member of Congress from the 4th Congressional District in the history of the district. I won the district with the biggest margins any Democrat has ever won it with. But it was I think I was fairly effective at speaking the truth, but trying to condense it down to about 30 seconds. I don't know that I can condense very much down to 10 seconds or 6 seconds. But a lot of what I did, and the way I won in 1989, I debated 11 times in that congressional race. We debated in every county once and in one county twice. And enough people came out and saw me and heard me that people who were interested, and because it was a special election, there was a somewhat lower turnout. And then after that, I spent virtually every weekend and every district work break meeting with groups as small as 3 or 4 and as large as 200 or 300 in the district. And I actually did much of it. The media, the paid media were important, but I think it was that I went around and I met so many people and I worked with so many people. Every invitation that came into the office, if it was at all physically possible for me to go, I would go. And many times I wouldn't speak. I would just go as a guest and I would be introduced, but then I would talk to people one-on-one afterward. And I think I would never have won had I not had that opportunity. It really was that one-on-one contact. And in a congressional district like ours, it is possible to do that. But I think that was probably as much a factor as the paid media. The paid media are important, but when you win with 1,800 vote margin in your first race, all the people that you shake hands with and talk to and listen to, they make a major difference.
But what happened in this last race, and I think Jill is the champion of constituent services. I watched her do it and tried to emulate her as much as possible. And I think, and we both lost, right? And so I think that what happened in this last election is that the environment went so sour that no Democrat was credible, period. It just, nothing that I could say one-on-one to anybody was necessarily believed, and I'm pretty persuasive, and I like to do that, and I had 40 town meetings the first year I was in office, and I had office hours where everybody called and talked to me, and I spent hours on the phone talking to anyone who wanted to talk to me about whatever, and I usually am really good at that, but the closer we got to election, the worse the environment got, and people started to say, that's not true. You didn't pass the Family and Medical Leave Act.
I had people say the same thing.
They
were being lied to. They were being lied to.
You're lying to me. And there was a long list of things like that. And so when, and I guess none of us can answer the question. It's the big mystery of our time right now. Why and how that environment went that sour that fast, I don't know the answer to that.
Well, we feed it. I mean, we do all these negative commercials. I mean, so you turn on and you say all of those people out there are just sleazy. I mean, they're ragging on one another.
No, I know.
Let me ask.
John, let's just get John, and that's the last question.
I'd just like to go back to a subject we covered before, but maybe draw from it some lessons for the future. As far as Social Security goes, I was, as a Republican, somewhat taken aback when Bob Dole and Newt Gingrich ruled Social Security off the table. I thought this was something that Republicans had always sort of taken a somewhat skeptical eye towards. But on the other hand, I saw the White House every day coming out with an attack saying Republicans are going to cut Social Security, and I couldn't listen to Dave Wilhelm on the TV without hearing him mention Social Security every other word, and Donna Shalala would say, as her model for the Clinton health plan, the Social Security Administration. So what I'm wondering is there are two lessons I want to draw out. One is, can we discuss an issue which is so important to all of us, but particularly to people in my generation, without throwing it around as a political football on the one hand, and on the other hand, if people from different ideologies or maybe not different ideologies, but just different parties as you and I can identify this as a serious problem, is there hope to work together without all the acrimony, without all the sort of sloganeering, to really try and solve this problem on And is there hope for me? I'm going to work to try and change my party to get them back to where they once were. And is it possible that people like you can work to change the leadership in your party to say, look, this is an issue that really is of vital importance?
I hope so. I think I don't know, but I can tell you that we are far away from it. And you're absolutely right. It's not a Democratic or Republican problem. It's everybody's problem. And the Democrats sees it just as much as the Republicans do, and it is as misleading on both sides. We worked very hard on Penny Kasich, which was this, you know what it was. I mean, it lost by 6 votes. And I think that is the only hope. I think that we've lost the sane center, that the moderate middle really has to get together and say, look, we have so much more in common than we do than either ends of the spectrum. And I think the only salvation is if we do that. And you are 100% right. I mean, you're absolutely on target.
Giving up I'll just very quickly, Marjorie, giving up the politics of fear is going to be the hardest thing we may ever have done. It is really hard. I mean, once it's going, to intervene and stop it is very difficult, and we're certainly not anywhere close to doing it.
With regard to building coalitions, they're going to have to be carved out of the middle. I don't think there's any question about that. And it is very difficult to do, and let me explain something that happened on November 8th. Many of us who lost our bids for re-election have pretty moderate voting records, pretty independent voting records, which means that we are always angering a different constituency. If you're conservative, you're just always angering the liberals. If you're liberal, you're always angering the conservatives. But we, from time to time, anger everybody a little bit, and we don't have anybody who is passionately behind us. We don't have, there's no such thing as a passionate middle or a passionate moderate, and that makes this an extreme challenge, I think, even though I think that certainly a majority of the American public fall somewhere in the middle as opposed to in the two extremes, but politically it is a real difficult thing to do.
Well, please join me in thanking the Congresswomen.